LEGO Star Wars 2, the original trilogy, is largely the game you'd expect it to be. Built on a slightly refined and polished version of the first game's engine, the original trilogy covers the movies in the original trilogy, A New Hope, The Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. Having found great success with the first title, it was a shoo-in to happen, and given its 2006 release, saw a much broader range of consoles, adding on an Xbox 360 version to the Windows, Gamecube, PS2, and Xbox, plus an expanded roster of handheld conversions with the GBA, DS, and PSP. There's changes here and there, but largely the game plays much like its prequel, but with a focus on the early entries in the series. That is to say, what worked there works here, and what didn't has been polished to some extent. Gameplay changes are fairly minimal. Most notably is that this game is much less centered on lightsaber and force users. There are only 4 living dudes that can use that stuff, and while Luke is the main character, it's not until the back half of the game that becomes his predominant playstyle, and even then a lot of levels don't center on him. To this end, blaster characters are much more at the forefront. Levels tend to be wider and have more space, hell, even the hub world is greatly expanded, although that's probably incidental. Most blaster characters now automatically dodge incoming projectiles while shooting, and can kinda double jump via roll out of the air in an attempt to make them more usable since you're on them so often. And levels tend to focus on building, running, and gunning, and platforming to account for the heavily different uses these characters have. The change in focus alone gives the game its own identity and feel, turning it more into a simplistic run and gunner than a simplistic brawler, which is an arguably more fun direction to go for most levels. Various other classes also have seen minor overhauls. The short characters who formerly couldn't attack now can, high jump is scrapped entirely, and a few new classes exist. Imperials like Stormtrooper now have their own doors to open and will be ignored by most enemies, and bounty hunters can throw bombs to shatter silver objects and also have their own set of doors to open. While the dynamic of the game is still largely unchanged, you swap characters to solve to their specific puzzles, I'd say the wider variety in character selection most levels and the more thoughtful puzzle and level design in general tends to keep the game more interesting to work through and generally more fresh. The most unique twist is stations throughout the game that give a character a Stormtrooper or Bounty Hunter helmet, giving them the abilities of those classes if they can avoid being hit, which is used to spice up even the levels with a lower character variety and add some challenge in dodging attacks or pre-clearing rooms to make a safe path. While the game is still very easy, it tends to be more engaging because there's a lot more to work with than Jedi. Other areas of the game got some love too. The character creator is pretty basic, but gives you a decent amount of freedom to make some silly dudes with a mixture of abilities. The hub world has seen the most change. Dexter's Diner in the first game was a single room with doors to 3 empty rooms with doors to levels. The cantina is much larger with various bonus levels to unlock via getting gold bricks, which are obtained by getting True Jedi. Ridiculously, you need to get True Jedi in the story and free play for some reason separately. All mini kits, and simply by beating the level. These unlock a variety of bonus challenges which add some new, more difficult options to the game. These add a little much needed variety to an otherwise very easy game, although the game is still fairly short and simple, and the bonus levels don't get too hard. The last notable addition to the gameplay is red bricks, which are collectibles in each stage alongside the mini-kits that unlock an extra. The roster and usefulness of which is greatly expanded by new insane bonuses like the stud multipliers, 2x, 4x, 6x, 8x, and 10x, which can stack for a total of 38, 40 times multiplier, which basically breaks True Jedi on every stage. The mini-kit detector to lighten the trouble of tracking them down, extra toggle which lets you play as various useless NPCs like Womp Rats in certain stages, fast build and fast force, more damage from all weapon types, infinite torpedoes for vehicle missions, and of course invincibility, plus the to be expected silly stuff like lightsaber colors. Regardless of anything else, it's hard not to say that in most regards, LEGO Star Wars 2 has way more going on than its older brother. Some new classes and mechanics based around new and returning classes, especially with the masks, more bonus content designed as something of a challenge mode, character creation on a larger hub. LEGO Star Wars 2 both comes out swinging with way more stuff to do, but also in the raw improvements made from the prior game's gameplay. Co-op is much improved too for what it's worth. The fairly wide and varied cast of the original trilogy often forces more asynchronous play, which makes the game actually feel like a multiplayer game most of the time rather than a rather clunky single-player experience with a lot of waiting for your co-op buddy to flip a switch for you, as the original game was frequently guilty of. The game has also seen some minor visual upgrades. Stylistically, stuff is basically unchanged, although the jump to the next generation means the game runs far smoother, especially on the Series X, which has backwards compatibility. The charming diorama versions of Star Wars locations are still intact, although you get less variety in the original trilogy, which is kind of a shame. That said, characters have a lot more fluid and detailed animation, including a small handful of characters with some unique stuff, like the Emperor, who kind of flips around when he attacks. The biggest upgrades seem to come in the form of lighting and effects. The static levels mean scene lighting doesn't need to be dynamic, but it can be more noticeably present and interesting. Meanwhile, lightsaber and particle effect look much cleaner as well. Musically, the game is still classic John Williams Star Wars, no complaints there, and the other sound design really sells the impacts well, and little grunts and screams of the dying Lego people are still funny. There's not a lot to say about it beyond what the first game was doing. It's still good Star Wars music. Structurally, the game is basically identical to the previous. 3 movies with 6 levels in each, this time with no accidental 5-level episodes. Most of which follow the fairly standard platforming action levels, though a few of which are vehicle levels in a more standardized vehicle mission engine and format. A New Hope probably struggles the most in that it's a movie fairly devoid of set pieces, leading to some rather apparent stretching. It begins strong enough with the Tantive 4 stuff, which serves to run you through the upgraded shooting, as that's the primary gameplay style of most of the game, but also quickly tosses in R2 and C-3PO. It's the most standard level in the game, and one of the shortest, making it great for subgrinding later in the game, but it's basically just a standard tutorial level. From there, these levels kinda have to meander. Through the Jedland Waste is basically the entire first third of the movie, which is largely dedicated to introducing us to Luke and the world in the movie, and turns it into a fairly long stretch of platforming through deserts and fighting Tusken Raiders, something that takes place in like 20 seconds of the movie. Not to say that it's bad or anything. The game is way better at making asynchronous co-op stuff, so one player being Luke and one player being Obi-Wan with his lightsaber feels pretty good. It also kind of crucially glances over some of the darker stuff in the movie, like Luke's uncle and aunt being turned into cartoon skeletons. I think they could have squeezed some funny gags out of that one. Mos Eisley Spaceport doesn't feel much less padded. A good portion of the level is the walk up to the spaceport, which shows off some of the increased ability that this game has to have multiple characters on the screen. Before you could only have like, I don't know, 10 or 15 on a good day, and here they just kind of throw NPCs everywhere to show off the power of the Xbox 360. There's a lot of bustling NPCs and enemies all at once, and you get to ride around in an ATST a bit, which is a new element some levels have in fully controllable, smaller vehicles in some stages. They sometimes get utilized in knocking down large walls, as they do here, but are more often than not just a fun power-up used to mow down a bunch of dudes or move through an area a little quicker, which is appreciable variety without going all out in a completely different gameplay style, I guess. Towards the end, the level briefly shifts into the Cantina, which is largely just a massive shootout around the Millennium Falcon until the end. It's not terrible by any means, it's just not very spectacular. The most egregious part of the game is the following 2 levels. Rescue the Princess is the Death Star stuff up until Leia's cell, and Death Star Escape is the latter half. Had they not needed to reach so hard to hit 6, this probably would have just been one level, as both halves feel pretty padded. Rescue the Princess is a series of shootouts with huge piles of stormtroopers, only broken up by some light mask shenanigans with stormtrooper gates. There are a few cool moments, like the NPC Obi-Wan building the bridge for the player, but like I said, A New Hope is kind of a struggle. The latter level somehow skips the most exciting part of the movie with the trash compactor and largely consists of shooting 8 million stormtroopers again. Again, it has some kind of neat stuff. The room where you need to move the grapple point around is more interesting than anything the first game had, but it's largely the same as the previous level. A New Hope ends on its only vehicle level Rebel attack, which is obviously the Death Star trench run. It shows off the basic vehicle gameplay that there's been implemented. It's top down, or mostly top down, pretty fast paced in part because the vehicles always move forward, a bit chaotic because of all the bullets and money cluttering the screen, but fun nonetheless, partially because it's kind of just simple and chaotic. The only real extraneous element to these are bombs, homing missiles used to blow up purple objects that can be held in limited quantities, although generally anytime you need them, there's some sort of generator close by. The actual trench run where you're chased by Vaders is really cool for all 7 seconds it goes on, although largely it's just a standard ship level. It's a nice pace breaker and a fun level type, but kinda the most generic of the vehicle missions in this game. Really, it's kind of exemplary of A New Hope in general. There's some really decent to solid levels that have been created by stretching a nearly actionless movie into 6 levels. Decent, but largely this entire episode can kinda just be considered an extended tutorial. As far as the game is concerned, The Empire Strikes Back has a huge advantage compared to the original trilogy. It has the most going on action-wise, and the widest variety of settings. The Battle of Hoth, Dagobah, Cloud City, Boba Fett and Darth Vader as villains, and you get a lot of variety in action here, in part because the movie is so focused on an ensemble cast of different characters. It does mean the pacing is a little better here too. Unlike A New Hope, it doesn't need to spend 2 full levels on one segment of the movie, and the story, while still largely told through silly pantomime, is a lot easier to follow and not hypothetical hypothetical scenario that you don't know what's going on. The Battle of Hoth is basically the standardized ship levels this game normally uses, but has a few twists on the formula. The Snowspeeder's grapples allow tipping over the ATSTs, AT-ATs, and dragging bombs around for a bit of spice. Although admittedly, the physics on the bomb are pretty questionable and can end up frustrating a lot of this level. Ship levels are a nice break, and it's cool that this game has managed to integrate them a lot better and make them a little less all over the place by making a standardized engine for them. The Escape from Echo Base is another fairly standard level. The Hoth setting lets them put ice physics in a few spots, although it's never really used to complicate platforming. It's mostly just for a few small set pieces like this slide thing. The level has at least one fairly neat puzzle, transporting C-3PO in a car to get him to higher levels as he lacks a jump, something you'd think would be a more common puzzle element throughout, since a character not being able to jump like everyone else is kind of a big deal. Falcon Flight is perhaps the most generic vehicle mission of the game. Not to say it's outright terrible, but you spend an awful lot of it shooting asteroids to farm torpedoes to shoot at larger asteroids. Like most of the vehicle levels, it's a change of pace, but far and away the least interesting vehicle mission this game has, and kind of a downer on what Empire Strikes Back has going on. Dagobah is probably the most fully realized asynchronous level out of the entire first set of LEGO Star Wars games. For the entire first 2/3 of the level, one player is Luke and one is R2. Luke can destroy stuff or use the Force to move stuff into place, while R2 can't be damaged by the swamp and can hover past large gaps to press buttons. R2 is a bit less fun to use inherently since he can't fight or anything, but it doesn't feel completely tedious for the player controlling it. When Yoda's brought into the mix, he plays a little bit better than before. He lacks the hover chair, but is generally less chaotic, and the boss fight against Phantom Vader, while brief and fairly simplistic, is a nice end to the stage. Plus, as with the movie, Dagobah has the best music in the game. While the final two stages here are both Cloud City, unlike the repeats in New Hope, the two are vastly different to a point it's hardly a bother. The first, Cloud City Trap, is an extremely extended boss fight against Darth Vader. As with the previous level, one player is stuck as R2, although here he feels much like the lesser component, only really existing to occasionally progress fights by flipping a switch arbitrarily to give him something to do. Ignoring the poor sat playing as R2 though, the level is quite good as a set piece in a fight. Every time Vader is fought, it's a new area and a new gimmick, needing R2 to stun him with gas to hit him, forcing projectiles he throws back at him, chasing him in brief platforming segments. It's a level that captures the spectacle and variety of the fight from the movie, and manages to be much more engaging than bosses usually are in this series. Betrayal over Bespin has an immediate leg up over most levels in the game, by nature of being based on the coolest looking area Star Wars has ever had. The sunsets look great, and it's also pretty fun in its own right. You get a brief Boba Fett fight, and unlike most levels which start you with your whole character roster, R2 needs to be found deeper in the level, who can then be used to get C-3PO to progress. Empire's a really nice set of levels, good variety, especially because the movie has a lot of action to adapt. And thanks to being pretty evenly spaced out, the movie ends up being largely comprehensible. Empire is definitely the strongest that this game has, and one of the stronger of the entire series. Return of the Jedi is a bit more of a mixed bag. Like Empire, it actually covers most of the movie, but Return of the Jedi's various action scenes translate to lesser results. Jabba's Palace is a good start. The bounty hunter masks are used well here as enemies consistently respawn unless switches are flipped, which makes it more difficult to get around with the mask. The character variety is good too, with Gunners, Luke, R2, C-3PO, and the level is fairly long and complex. Plus the Rancor fight is a neat blend of action and puzzle, luring it around to spots where rocks can be dropped on it. It's not very difficult as the Rancor is pretty sluggish and non-aggressive, but it's still a cool set piece to start the episode with. The Great Pit of Carkoon is a little less cool. The opening bit jumping across the sand skids is kinda neat, and it's funny that the Boba Fett fight is like 10 seconds long like in the movie. But the back half has a lot of fairly tedious stuff. The disco room is a lot of building stuff. The entire last bit on top of the big skiff has endlessly respawning enemies constantly interrupting you while you're trying to push boxes around. It all just becomes a little bit irritating. The speeder bike chase also feels a little bit wonky, kind of first game vehicle mission-ish in a way. It lacks the free control of the other vehicle levels and instead is a constant forward push around a looping track to track down and shoot stormtroopers on their bikes while dodging obstacles. It sounds kind of fun, and when you kind of get to the grips with what it's trying to get you to do, it kind of is. But as vehicle missions tend to go, in co-op the camera tends to disagree with how the game is supposed to be played. Characters love to get stuck on hard objects if they're not instantly killed, and it makes levels substantially more frustrating, especially if you don't know you have to loop-de-loop whenever the troopers fall behind you to catch up with them. Between every round on the speeder bikes, there's also brief puzzle-solving segments to segue into the next breakup for the breakup, which is fine enough, and getting to briefly control the AT-AT at the end is pretty cool. The Battle of Endor is a fairly generic level, all things considered. It's the only mandatory appearance of the short characters in this game. Thankfully, Wicket can actually attack, but it's a lot of combat in forests. Any segment that you get to be in an ATST for is a good one, but it's a fairly average and a bit too long of a mission. The Emperor fight is okay, but way too short. The Luke and Vader team up should be the high of the game, but after hitting the Emperor a few times, he runs through an area, and you chase him and hit him a few times and repeat and it's over. The level doesn't have much for platforming, the fight doesn't play out as interestingly as the Vader one in Empire or have any real gimmicks, and it realistically only takes like 5 minutes to blow through or so. The finale is also a little bit limp. In the movie, the Millennium Falcon flying into the Death Star plays out alongside the stuff going on with Luke and Vader, although that would have been very disorienting if not outright impossible in this game's engine. Still, the emotional core of the game is past, and ending on a vehicle mission that lasts about 5 minutes and almost entirely consists of flying straight forwards, shooting a few things, then flying back feels even weaker than the Emperor fight was. While the main missions are decent if a bit average here, it's really the vehicles and underwhelming final boss that drag down Return of the Jedi. Like A New Hope, the levels don't have a lot going on, and that's besides the fact that the most exciting parts of the movie are relegated to 2 extremely basic 5-minute levels. It's a really flat ending to the episode, which is kind of disappointed. LEGO Star Wars 2 has a pretty substantial amount of bonus content, much more than the character grind and singular level of the first game. The quality of the content is a bit middling at times, although there is some neat stuff. Beyond the first game's true Jedi, which in this game needs to be done separately for story and free play as I mentioned, which is some ridiculous padding that they never bothered repeating, and mini kits are red bricks, even more secret collectibles in each levels that unlock an extra for purchase when found. Like I said before, there's a lot more interesting extras in the game because of this. The grind to get the score multipliers will probably keep these from breaking the main game. They're pretty costly to start, the ×2 and ×4 especially. We did a lot of grinding before we were able to break the game in half. Even though you probably won't get the really good ones by the time you complete the main game, there's something really satisfying about turning the game into a complete joke through the power of grinding. There's also a good bit of bonus levels and modes. Super Story is kind of interesting, requiring the player to go through the whole episode in one go and collect 100,000 studs while doing it. It's honestly a fairly low amount if you're putting in any effort, but also keeping it under an hour can kind of make it an interesting challenge. That said, it's a bit tedious to push through given that you've done every mission at least twice for the story True Jedi and the free play True Jedi, plus all the mini kits and shit. And you're also forced to rewatch the cutscenes for some reason, which kind of grinds the Super Story to a halt. The other 2 are just simple stud collecting challenges in small unique areas, requiring reaching 1 million. In the character one, you can play as whatever character you want, and in the second you can use any minikit vehicle, which are unlocked by getting all the minikits in the level, and some of which are fairly unique, if useless like the AT-AT. The time limit on these is all 5 minutes, so they're pretty inoffensive and mindless. There are also 10 bounty hunter missions to complete, which are fun and frantic 3-minute challenges to find a certain character in a small portion of the level, usually somewhere in the middle and with the character usually tucked pretty deep into it, with the caveat that you can only use the bounty hunters, all of which appear in a giant blob on your screen at once, which is kind of funny, and all of which have a variety of abilities to help explore levels. It's a kind of neat bite-sized challenge that rewards you for having explored the levels thoroughly to know all the nooks and crannies to look for characters in. Lastly, the game has its own bonus level tucked at the end in Lego City. It's an untimed, small open sandbox level that is completed upon finding 1 million studs, although there are very few over the requirement, or maybe there's exactly 1 million. It requires you to thoroughly explore the city and interact with everything on screen to progress. There's no enemies or any risk, but it's kind of fun as a victory lap because you just get to fuck around and smash everything and break a bunch of stuff, and there's a bunch of vehicles to control. Although by the end, once you get down to like finding the last couple thousand studs, it becomes really tedious. It'll take you like 15 minutes to find the last 2 or 3 studs, which is really obnoxious in the end. It kind of wears out its welcome at the end, and it maybe would have been nicer just to have like some kind of other bonus level. I don't really know what you would do with Star Wars as a bonus level at this point, because all the episodes have been playable and there wasn't really a lot of like movie-based side content at that time. Now it's time for the super lame part of the video, the half conclusion. LEGO Star Wars 2 is a substantially better made game than its predecessor. Most classes have way more to do, levels are more complex, and some puzzles actually qualify as puzzles. Vehicle missions have been standardized for the better, the game looks a bit nicer, and the side content is greatly expanded even if most of it is kind of annoying. That doesn't all come together in the levels themselves though. These movies just don't have the pile of set pieces to pull from that the prequels do to make for as exciting a game. Episode 4 struggles to come up with level concepts for most of its midsection, and Episode 6 ends on a really rushed bum note. I do think it's a better game in most aspects, almost entirely to do with the application of a ton of polish, but it also has to live in the shadow of the complete saga, the compilation game that combines the first 2 games and gives the first game the polish this one has, as well as heaps on a ton of extra content. Like the first game, beyond nostalgia, LEGO Star Wars 2 doesn't stand on its own because of its far superior re-release that would come out hardly a year later. More LEGO Star Wars soon. It's exactly what you expect. It's the complete saga.